The Syrian conflict rages on while parties gather in Geneva for talks. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. If you need a reminder on how complicated the situation is in Syria, listen to this. On Monday, United Nations Special Envoy Staffan de Mistura declared that indirect talks between the Syrian government and the opposition had officially begun in Geneva. Just 24 hours later, that was anything but certain. The latest push to end the Syrian conflict appeared to fall apart as the Assad government denied formal talks had started, while the opposition cancelled a meeting with the UN envoy following intense Russian airstrikes near the town of Aleppo. Later, we'll talk with a spokesperson for a pro-democracy group in Syria and an advisor to the Syrian Ministry of Information. But first, we turn to CCTV's Jack Barton in Brussels. And Jack, you were at those Geneva talks. What happened? Why did they appear to have broken down even before they got started?
Well, the fundamental stumbling block appears to be at what point in the talks there should be a ceasefire or something vaguely resembling a ceasefire. The main opposition coalition, known as the High Negotiations Committee, initially said they wouldn't attend the talks unless, as a precondition, there was an end to aerial bombardment of rebel-held positions, an end to sieges, and also for the Syrian government to allow humanitarian access throughout the country. It then turned up but kept those conditions on the table and said it wouldn't begin negotiating until those conditions were met. Worth noting, those are conditions that the UN is also calling for. We heard from Staffan de Mistura, the UN point man on Syria, saying the talks really had to translate into facts on the ground for the Syrian people, and that would mean a ceasefire. But while the Syrian government has allowed, through one aid convoy into an area just near Damascus, that it calls a goodwill gesture, it says it's not prepared to negotiate on humanitarian aid or on ending hostilities until the actual negotiations to a peace process begin. So we've got two conflicting points of view about when that ceasefire has come, and the opposition has said that it remains a precondition for them. They're giving it to the end of the week, and if it doesn't happen, they're going to walk out.
And Jack, also a big question over who's at the table. There are a number of players involved here. Are all parties represented at these negotiations?
Not at all, not even close. The opposition group that is there is the Saudi Arabia-backed High Negotiations Committee, initially turning up with 17 negotiators, ranging from secular-orientated group to the downright radical groups like the Army of Islam, which at least in the past unquestionably had links to Al-Qaeda. But there are thousands of opposition groups in Syria, of course. Most of them hold more territory than the ones at the negotiating table, like the Nusra Front or ISIL, which are considered too radical to be involved in these talks, but also the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, the PYK, which holds a large part of northern Syria, but Turkey has pushed for that group to be excluded because it believes it's linked to the PKK, a Kurdish group fighting for independence within Turkey. On top of that, the Syrian government has a variety of militias fighting along its side, including Hezbollah from Lebanon, not to mention Russia, which is also defending its warm water naval port in the Mediterranean. So with all of these divides, the Sunni Shia divide, the secular Islamist divide, which is on both sides, including having all these regional and global players in the mix, even if you had just the government and one opposition group, that would still be no guarantee of a peace agreement. But with this multitude in the mix, or wanting to be in the mix in many cases, it's just made it so much more complex.
Okay, Jack, thanks. That's CCTV's Jack Barton reporting. Joining us from Damascus is Bassam Abu Abdullah. He's the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at Damascus University. With us here in Washington is Rafif Jouajati. She's the spokesperson for local coordination committees in Syria, a pro-democracy network of activists. And Amar Wakaf is a Syrian political analyst and the director of Gnosos, focusing on Syria and the Middle East. He joins us from London. And let's start in London with Amar. Amar, what is your sense of where the talks are right now? I mean, we're hearing that they've collapsed. Have they?
Well, we're not hearing that there is a bit of so much dramatic collapse, but as Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, said, there would be a lot of postering and what have you. We understand that he went to the hotel of the opposition delegation to meet them there after they refused to go to the UN headquarters. So I wouldn't call that a collapse, but he did warn that it's not going well and it may collapse. However, the Syrian head of the delegation, Dr. Bashar Jafari, mentioned that, well, the preparatory phase for these negotiations and these talks is probably going to take a bit longer. We think that it will take time for some sort of a formation phase to go through, and the opposition need to agree on who's who and who's going to attend, whether they're going to have other members coming from other denominations of the opposition or not. But at the end of the day, we're hoping that probably by a few days later, at least the phase of forming the oppositional delegation is going to end.
Bassam, what is the Syrian government's position on these talks? The government has lodged several objections to the talks right now, especially on the question of when a ceasefire will take place. Does it take place before the talks start, during the talks, or after the talks? What is the position?
There is no precondition for the Syrian government delegation. The Syrian government delegation, I think the chief of this delegation, Dr. Bashar Jafari, mentioned that we still, until now, have no names with whom we will negotiate and with whom we will have indirect talks. Until now, there is 3 delegations in Geneva. The first delegation representing Riyadh Conference. The second one is a secular democratic delegation. The third one from inside Syria as opposition. So we are in front of mixed opposition. We don't know with whom we should deal. The other important thing that there is no precondition, and that it was Mr. de Mistura explained that if we want to have indirect talks, so we should put all files on the table and to start step by step. But until now, the Syrian delegation don't feel that there is serious will from the other side, which I don't know with whom. The other side, I mean here, if it's the Riyadh Conference delegation or the secular democratic or the other. Still, we have a lot of sticking points in front of these negotiations. But I think the Syrian delegation, the government Syrian delegation, is a very serious, and they are dealing with the United Nations resolution 2254 and with a lot of Security Council resolutions for combating terrorism, which the Syrian government considering the first priority to push any kind of political solution to solve the Syrian problem. Right. Besides that, I want to mention one very, very fast point, that there is a involvement from engagement from regional players like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, sometimes Britain. We don't know that if we are in front of a real delegation, opposition delegation, or in front of a different interest of regional and international players.
Rafif, is that your understanding as well, that no sides have put down any preconditions here, that everything's on the table?
Well, just hearing from Dr. Abu Abdullah, I've already heard some preconditions. He said that he doesn't know who the opposition is, although it has been declared for some time. I would say a major sticking point is that we are in Geneva to discuss a resolution to the Syrian crisis, which has resulted in more than 300,000 deaths, which has resulted in more than half the population being displaced. And we are still talking about, we are begging for the regime and its Russian allies to stop the bombardment and to lift the starvation sieges. I would say that that is not a precondition, but a moral obligation.
What do we know about the humanitarian situation right now? I mean, it's been getting steadily worse as the months go by.
It's been getting increasingly worse. To call this now the worst humanitarian disaster since World War II is an understatement. We have more than half of the original population that is now either refugeed abroad or displaced internally. We have up to 400,000 people who are starving to death. We have a United Nations that is incapable of delivering aid to besieged areas because the Assad regime prohibits 9 out of 10 convoys from entering those areas. So this is a situation that is now, I think, a full-fledged genocide.
Amar, as we've been hearing, this tragedy continues. It's a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Now, since the start of the Syrian conflict, there's been something like 250,000 people who've died. More than half of Syria's population have fled their homes. Do you see a political solution to this crisis that would leave Bashar al-Assad in power, or does he have to go?
I think what we need to do is stop thinking about President Bashar al-Assad in his own right. I think we need to understand how certain or various Syrian factions and Syrian people look at this crisis, what it meant for them. Some people were pretty much enthusiastic that it would lead to a better future. Others were not so enthusiastic about it, and others saw it as a threat. I think whatever government comes into place, it needs to take the interests and hopes of the majority of all these groups. And if a certain part of the Syrian population believes that sticking to the current sticking to the current political setup is going to save their lives and going to save their interests, then that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, I think what the latest thinking now is, and this may be the understanding between the big players, the Russians and the Americans, is that the end game would be a political system whereby people can advocate their own ideas, they would feel free, this would be guaranteed, and then they would go into elections, and in those elections anyone can actually present their candidacy and come forward, including President Assad. Now, at the end of this transitional period or whatever, if someone can come in and convince the Syrian people that he has a better offer, or who could guarantee probably a better future for them and defeat President Assad in election, then good for him. If not, and you know, certain Syrian people perhaps think already that a lot of intervention from the likes of Saudi Arabia, from the likes of Turkey, a lot of policy of destabilizing the entire region from the likes of Europe and the United States is the major reason, it is the main reason why they are suffering so much, then President Assad probably could stay. But at the end of the day, Syrian people need to have all the choices in front of them in order to decide the best decision, make the best decision for them and for their children.
Bassam, the Syrian government launched an offensive, a major offensive in rebel-held areas around Aleppo, and these attacks were backed by Russian airstrikes. What does this tell us about the government's intent to negotiate a solution in good faith?
We should differ between two important things. I am here not representing, I am not speaking on behalf of the government, but I want to mention different points. Ms. Jouejat is speaking about revolution. She is sitting in Washington. I am sitting in Damascus, and we are really here suffering, but we are suffering from terrorism, we are suffering from Wahhabi movements, and we are suffering from a lot of things, and from logistic support from Saudi Arabia, from Turkey, for thousands of tourists came from around the world. Either the United Nations recognized that. So we should differ between terrorism and real will of the Syrian people to have a better country. While to compare with 2010, you should go to the data about Syrian community in education, in the children situation, or in the healthcare. It's better than a lot of Arab countries. So we should speak objectively, not to talk about revolution which is leading from Wahhabi movements and Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood movements. We are supporting the dialogue between the Syrian people. The other important thing that we should differ between the war against terrorism, which will continue, is it doesn't matter if Geneva is working or not working. supporting. We are in front of terrorist groups, getting support from open borders with from Turkish government, and everyone knows that. The United States recognizes that. Everyone knows that the government of Erdogan is supporting these terrorist groups, and we will continue that, and we will not stop until defeating the ISIL and al-Nusra. If we will speak about other groups, I think the international community still, there is no fixed list for where is the terrorist groups and where is not terrorists. Until now, we will continue fighting against all kind of groups who are getting support from outside, because they are not revolutionary. The revolution it doesn't mean that we should destroy whole Syria for this dirty revolution. I think that we have the right to have better future, but not through Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey or through the Wahhabism.
Okay, Rafif, aren't we hearing the crux of the problem here, that the Syrian government regards this as a war on terrorism, not a fight for democracy?
Actually, no, we're not hearing the crux of the problem. What we're hearing is from a person who enjoys the protection of the Syrian regime in Damascus. I would defy your guests to travel in Homs, in Hama, in Deir ez-Zor, in Idlib, in Raqqa. I would defy them to step out of their comfort zones and then tell me about what the Syrian people want. No, the crux of the problem is that we have a dictatorship that has been in place for nearly 50 years, and the people have had enough. The crux of the problem now has shifted, and we are under Russian occupation. This is part of the crux of the problem. I heard a lot of disjointed statements about terrorism and Wahhabis, and there was almost an accusation that I represent Al-Qaeda or some of these Islamist terrorists. Absolutely not. I represent civil society. I represent the part of Syria that has come out genuinely for freedom and dignity and democracy, and an end to the tyranny and corruption of the Assad regime.
Very quickly, before we go to a break, what do you make of Omar's solution that there be elections, and if Bashar al-Assad wants to stand, well, fine?
In a country where elections have been limited to yes and no votes, and no voters have been prosecuted, I don't see how we can have free and fair elections unless they are monitored, in which case the monitoring needs to have some teeth. I don't know that we can reach that. I think the demands of the people have been extremely clear in calling for the ouster of the Assad regime.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the ongoing Syrian conflict and UN-sponsored peace talks in Geneva. Let's get right back to it. Omar, what is your view on the Russian involvement in Syria? The British Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, has accused the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, of undermining international efforts to end this war. And we just heard Rafif tell us just a moment ago that this is effectively a Russian occupation.
Well, I disagree. I think, in fact, the Russian intervention since, a few months back, the 30th of September, has actually accelerated the political process. We now have a more realistic political process instead of the high-ceiling demand sort of Geneva I communique. Let's just get rid of President Assad, get a transitional body with full authorities, and let's dream on. Now it's a bit more realistic, and let's have a national unity sort of government, and let's acknowledge that President Assad is going nowhere. So. What the problem, the Russian intervention, what it has actually done is that it shattered the dream of an imminent fall of the Syrian regime or the Syrian state. And that could only lead to one outcome, which is for people on the ground who have the weapons, especially the Syrian ones, even though they might have some fancy ideas about an Islamic state, a Salafi state or whatever, they need to think rationally, and they will be thinking rationally. If the regime cannot be defeated, or if the state cannot be defeated, then why should we spend all these resources and make all these sacrifices? Let's go and sit on the table. So in my opinion, actually, it has hastened a solution, not stopped the solution.
Rafif?
I actually disagree quite vehemently, of course. I believe that the Russian intervention certainly served as a catalyst, and that was to save the Assad regime from imminent collapse. Of course, the Russians are using sophisticated air power and targeting civilian institutions. We know from various reports that the Russians are not targeting ISIL or Islamist brigades. They are targeting hospitals. They are targeting schools and marketplaces. They are targeting members of the opposition that are not necessarily of an Islamist persuasion. So in fact, they are targeting any opposition to the Assad regime. I think that is an important point that needs to be made. This has been published pretty extensively. I think we need to quit denying that.
Okay. Bassam, what is your view on Russia's involvement?
I think that the Syrian government, under the international law, asking for help. And I think we should differ between two important things. There are beautiful slogans about democracy and human rights, which we are hearing from Washington, where the people sitting with electricity, with water, while we are sitting to listen to this discussion. I think we are facing here in Syria terrorism and international terrorism. Either United States, either many congressmen and the media in the United States recognizing that this is ISIL, this is al-Nusra and other terrorist groups a lot. And I don't think that Mrs. Jouejati will be very proud to be a part of a revolution which is, who is fighting on the ground. They are all Muslim Brotherhood and Wahhabism. I know that better than her, and we cannot build society through replacing the dictatorship, what you are calling dictatorship of President Assad, with the dictatorship of Saudi Arabia or Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who are now a model for the people here. I will compare between two important things. We have geopolitical confrontation here in Syria. We should stop to use the beautiful slogans about democracy, human rights, and freedoms. And if the United States is serious to build democracy, they should start from Saudi Arabia, where is, I think, dictatorship very dirty and which is dangerous for the generally the international security in the whole world. So I think if you will replacing Bashar al-Assad, the other model will be Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and its extremism in Syria. And I think the two models in Iraq and Libya give us when the collapsing of the Syrian state, what will happen in Syria. Syria is complicated society, and I don't think that we can build democracy and freedom, which we are looking for, but it needs a long process, it needs more culture, and it cannot be through Wahhabism. I will repeat that. Wahhabism, what we can see on the ground, it's only Wahhabism. If she is proud of Wahhabism, I will congratulate her with its alliance with Saudi Arabia and with this opposition which is sitting in the hands of Wahhabism in Riyadh.
Okay, I want to go back to Omar. Omar, I want to get back to the talks that are taking place right now, the proposed talks. I mean, one of the aims is to get a ceasefire in place. So once this is in place, you can get convoys going through to thousands of people who are starving there. But the question is, who monitors this ceasefire? I mean, there have even doubts been expressed by the UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura. There was a confidential document that he wrote in which he said that he has misgivings about how this ceasefire will be enforced. I mean, one of the solutions being looked at is that it be enforced by the Syrian government itself and some of the armed rebellion. I mean, is that realistic?
Well, the problem we have is that, you know, we hear the talk of the opposition figures, and I do respect some people, but actually they have very little leverage on the ground. So if the Syrian government and the opposition delegation decides that, you know, let's start this ceasefire, and by the way, the UN resolution didn't speak about a ceasefire, but a ceasefire that goes in parallel with the negotiations or the talks in Geneva, which tells you that they are a bit realistic about really enforcing such a ceasefire, and that it could probably start in certain areas. Now, the problem we have is that there are groups on the ground who are bent to sabotage everything that is being agreed upon. So let's just take Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, and their accomplices, Ahrar al-Sham, who are also of a Salafi group. They are the ones who are fighting in northern Aleppo today. And by the way, the Syrian army today, just before we came into the studio, managed to break a siege that has been holding for more than 3 years against 2 towns in northern Aleppo by Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra. And those people have clearly said, you know, we don't want these negotiations. This regime is an infidel regime. Now, I do appreciate what Rafif is trying to say, but actually this is not, is it really a dictatorship and a democracy issue? Or is it that certain groups on the ground who have all those weaponry, have all these brilliant ideology that they want to impose on us? And that is the crux of the problem, actually. It's not that, you know, let's have a democracy. Had democracy been the issue, no two Syrians would have really split in opinion about this. You wouldn't have the Syrian population split horizontally and vertically around this problem. The main issue is that now Jabhat al-Nusra, Daesh, ISIS, or whatever you want to call it, Ahrar al-Sham, Jais al-Islam, they do not want this negotiation to take place. Why? Because the main reason why they mobilized the forces was to kick out an infidel regime. That's how they see it. Now, in order to bring those people, at least the Syrians out of them, because we understand that there are so many Chechens, Uzbeks, you know, Saudis, Tunisians, Indonesians, whatever, amongst their ranks, at least the Syrians, we need to make things a little bit obvious to them in order to bring them into the negotiation table, into the political processes, and that's not going to be easy.
Rafif, isn't that one of the problems, is that when we talk about the opposition in Syria, we're talking about something like, what, 1,500 groups, according to the United States. It says there's 1,500 different groups that call themselves the opposition. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get all those groups to sign on to a deal.
Oh, absolutely. It's become very complex in Syria. But I would like to jump on an earlier point. We do need to be talking about the people of Syria. We need to be talking about not the politicians or those who call themselves politicians or experts on Syria. We need to be talking about civilians. And we need to see what the civilians have been demanding. So I do know from extensive surveys in Syria that people in Syria are demanding regime change. Yes, it is a question of democracy versus tyranny. That tyranny applies to the armed rebel groups that do have an Islamist, jihadist bent, who call anybody who doesn't agree with them infidels. But I would say that the Assad regime is equally guilty. The Assad regime has stood on a platform of secularism, which is false. It has stood on a platform of inclusiveness, which is false. We know today, after 300,000 dead, that anybody who is not pro-Assad is labeled as a terrorist, or when convenient, a Wahhabi supporter, or Al-Qaeda, or Daesh, or whatever names they can throw out. Clearly, this is not all of the opposition.
That's where we have to leave it. Rafif Juajati, Dr. Bassam Abu Abdullah, Amar Waqaf, thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.